So in this particular episode of Just Another Day in Paradise, we're focusing on replacing some of our outdated electronics. We've had the boat always outfitted with auto helm electronics and RayMarine electronics, combination of both, but now they've been replaced by RayMarine. So the last thing that went out on us was our Autopilot just as we're about to head south. So we picked up the replacement components and replacing some of our instruments at the same time. So as you can see, this is our new box for the Autopilot here. We've got the RayMarine, the Evolution Series 400 Autopilot. And this is to replace our existing ST7000 that's downstairs now. We also picked up a new I-70 instrument that's going to replace our wind instrument and depth sounder, everything else. And picked up one of the new ITC5s, which is one of the devices that allows us to use our existing through hulls down below, so that we can still use our speed sensor, depth sounder, wind instrument, all of that, and not have to change everything. They just wire into this ITC5, and the ITC5 carries into the CTOG bus for the RayMarine system that we're installing now. So this is the ACU 400. This is the control device that powers the linear drive that's coupled to our rudder, and that's what actually steers the boat. So this device here is what handles the current and provides power to our Type 2 linear electric drive that's on the rudder. So that we have to replace our existing electronics. And then we also have the new pilot control. So this is the gauge that sits at the helm station that we use to actually control the Autopilot from. And then this piece right here is actually more or less the brain of the system, because this is what tells the Autopilot what the boat is doing, where it is in 360 space. It has a 9-axis sensor with accelerometers in all directions that tell us exactly what the boat is doing. So if it's pitching up or down over a wave or sideways, if it's being veered off course, either way. It also has the compass inboard. So this is actually the brain that tells the computer what to do in relation to where the boat is going and to put it back on course. So these are all the components that we need to replace from our existing ST7000 system. And that's what we're going to start with next. So the first thing we did was to go back into the stern area of the boat where the control unit and the linear drive are attached to the rudder. And that is where we had to disconnect the wiring and disconnect the linear drive unit from the rudder quadrant itself. So after disconnecting all the wiring from the old control unit, that's this guy right here. This is our Type 300 from our old ST7000 Autopilot. And this one, you'll notice, has a whole pile of hookups on the front of it. There's a lot of different connections there that have to be wired in independently, one wire at a time. So it's a little bit more complex of an install, and of course it's not compatible with what we're installing now, because the RayMarine new systems, the new Evolution Autopilots by RayMarine, have greatly simplified the installation procedure. Now what they've done is gone to a single cable system, so you have a backbone system through the whole boat that is just one cable through all various connectors that have T-fittings on them. So this is one of the backbone cables here, and this is what runs from one of your T-fittings. They just plug directly in, one time, locks into place, and then you plug another blue backbone cable in from here, take it to wherever you want in the boat, wherever your instruments are going to be, another control unit, display unit. If you want to have another display unit or GPS system downstairs, you can just run this blue wire to anywhere you want, and then from the white, that's your spur connector. You just put in one of the spur connectors here, and then that'll connect instantly into one of your gauges. So then this would just go directly into one of the gauge. So you can see this is one of the new gauges. This is the new Autopilot control here, the new P70 unit. And you turn it around, it just has two connections. And one is just a bridge through connector. So if you take one of the white cables and plug that in, lock it into place, you're good to go. It's hooked to the main bus now, and now this is connected to everything else that's hooked into the backbone that is eventually hooked back into the control unit for the Autopilot system. So then if you have another gauge, basically you just put the cable into this one right here, plug this into the back of the other gauge, and they're just daisy chained together. Single cable hookup, controls your power, transmits data, everything all in one. And this one here is one of their junction fittings. This one's a main bus connector where you can hook in one of the backbone cables, continue on through your next section of the boat, but here you can take off 3 actual connections if you've got a bunch of gauges or different types of instruments. We can use this right at the Autopilot control itself so that we can hook it up to the Autopilot, the ACU 400. We can also hook it up to our ITC5, which is the adapter for all of our depth sounder and other through-hull instruments. And then the other one is going to go to the EV1, which is our sensor for the direction finding of the boat. And that's the one that is replacing our electronic compass. And another major consideration is the actual mounting spot for the compass. You got to pay attention to this because you don't want to have the compass located near anything metal on the boat. And usually there's not a lot of metal. I mean, it's all stainless steel, so anything like that, but it's stuff that you put on the boat, so that's what you have to be careful of. I learned that the hard way because when I got Sophisticated Lady originally, I didn't realize where the compass for the Autopilot was located, and I used to use this locker here as my storage for tools, and I didn't realize, but one time we were sailing the boat and I dropped my toolbox into the locker, and the boat went whoosh. I was like, what the hell was that? But it took me a little bit to figure out, okay, it wasn't a problem with the Autopilot, it was it was the steel tools causing all the problems because they were this far from the compass. Because as you can see underneath the floor, where we put it in the other cabinet, where we've put it in the other cabin, it's actually located right underneath this storage locker in the cockpit. Now, we don't use this locker for anything other than just soft gear, so it's full of canvas, it's full of dive gear, it's got some BCs, fishing gear, things like that, but nothing major, and it doesn't affect the compass at all. So everything is all good there now. Now we use the other side for all the tools, and that's where we keep everything metallic. So now that we've taken out the central course computer, the next thing we had to do is disconnect and check everything to do with our linear drive, because we're not replacing the linear drive. It's still operational, everything was good there. It was just the course computer and the electronics that died on us. But in taking it out, we disconnected it from the rudder quadrant and noticed that one of the mounts that I had made up a bunch of years ago, this was something, wow, this was like 7 years ago, and I remember we were out in the middle of the Atlantic, coming from Bermuda, across the Gulf Stream to New York, and we went through a hell of a gale. It was nasty. We had big square waves and the boat was just literally falling off the end of these waves. We would launch off one and we went over the side of one, and everybody who was on board remembers this moment to the day, I'm sure. It was quite an adventure, but we went off the top of this wave and the boat literally became airborne. There was nothing. I was standing in the companionway and my feet came off the ground. I looked around and everything just rose up and then fell again as the boat came back down. And it came off that wave and down, and bang, it just collapsed onto the top, or to the bottom of the next wave. And in doing so, it completely sheared off the pin that our linear drive unit is fastened or welded at the time. It was actually welded to the rudder quadrant. That's how much force. It was amazing we didn't actually break the rudder, but the rudder put so much pressure back through the system that this big pin that was actually welded to a big heavy mount on the quadrant just sheared off completely, and we had no autopilot. And we're in the worst storm ever, and now we're hand steering, and I've got people on board that I'm training, and everybody's like, oh my God, what are we gonna do now? So immediately we had to set to work in the middle of the ocean, and we had to start looking at something, because the aluminum rudder quadrant, you can't just weld that at sea, you can't make metal repairs or anything like that, so we needed to fabricate something. And that's where I just come up with some good pieces of hardwood and basically cut out 2 of them that I sandwiched around the quadrant. So sandwiched them on the quadrant, bolted them together, and then this pin would bolt through and sit like that, and then the autopilot could hook back up to the pin again. So we fabricated that mount and put it together, and it's been there for 7 years and doing an excellent job. But when we just took the autopilot apart this time, we noticed, and this was a good indication, a good reason to have checked it, that it was slowly wearing away at the wood. The wood has just been eroded away, and the pin was wobbling so bad. I mean, it was probably, a few more months maybe it would have lasted, and then it would have just fallen out, which isn't life-threatening. You lose your autopilot, you have to take control, but it's never a good time to happen. It always happens when you're at sea, and of course when the shit hits the fan and it's howling and blowing, and just like it was last time. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace the same mount, because this one worked so well for so long. It was actually better than the fitting that was welded onto the system, and much stronger. We've been in just as bad a weather since. But we've been using for a lot of our repairs around the boat just simple starboard, which is something you can buy at any of the local chandleries as well. And we picked this up at Budget Marine a while ago. But this piece of starboard is 1/2 inch thick. It's the same actual diameter as the wood that we used here last time. But we're going to cut out new pieces. We're going to make the new quadrant mount for the linear drive again with the starboard this time, because this stuff is practically bulletproof. I mean, it's very easy to work with. You can use a jigsaw, drill, anything like that. But it's hard as nails. You can't break it to save your life. So we're going to use that to make a new coupling, and we're also going to use that to make a new panel here for our instruments. Because as you see with our instruments that we've had installed on the boat for years, they've all been nicely set out in a row here, 3 of them. But the new instruments, of course, when you replace old with new, it's very, very seldom that you're actually going to have something that's an identical match or an exact fit. So we've already undone everything from below here. We've taken out the wiring, and now we're just left with the instruments sitting in the holes. As you can see, we pull out the instruments and we've got small holes for mounting there, and this one has its own hole here, and same along the line. But now we're going to a different system, and we're only putting in 2 gauges at this particular time, although we will put in a third at a later date. We're going to take the starboard and measure it off. We're making a panel here. We measured it off. It's going to be 16 inches long by 5 inches wide. And then we're putting in the first 2 gauges, one in the center and one offset to the left, and we're leaving the section on the right-hand side for our future expansion when we put in the next I-70 gauge at a later date. Okay, so for this part, we just need some general tools. Hello, really? For this part, we just need some tools, that being our power drill, drill some pilot holes, and also a jigsaw just to cut the plastic with the starboard. So we've taken our template for the gauge, because this is the main thing we need to do, is make the trim plate for the new gauges. So this little template just has this, it shows us the size of hole we need to cut and where the screw locations are, everything like that. So we've mapped that out onto our starboard, and we've redrawn all of the circles onto the starboard as well, and laid out where all the holes are. And you can see we've already piloted the holes for the screw mounts. And we've also taken the 2 pieces for our rudder mount, the old pieces of plywood that have eroded, and we've just drawn them out on the starboard as well. So they've been sourced out. We've already put the holes through, mapped them out, drilled them, and all we need to do is just cut the plastic now. Okay, so we've just finished cutting out our templates. We've got the mount for the 2 gauges that's going to go on the dash here on the helm. And we've got our new piece to couple the Autopilot for the linear drive to couple to the quadrant. So we got that to fit out afterwards. But right now what we need to do is, because of course the 2 gauges that are going in are different sizes and mounting requirements than the previous gauges, we're just going to put this on the helm station here where we had the other gauges set up, line it up with the new holes I've drilled, and just mask out some of the areas we need to cut out. All right. So we got everything marked out now, and this is where a tool like a Dremel comes in very handy, because you can't get access with a jigsaw in here without taking the wheel off or the mount off or anything like that. So it's very handy to have a rotary cutting tool that can actually just go in and slice everything out. So we're going to try that here now. So we finished making our extra cutouts now. We've got the piece all cleaned up, ready to go. We've put a little insulation gasket across the back of it, just a little weather seal, just to help keep any rain, ocean water, anything like that from going down in behind the gauges, because we've used the topside template. So we're going to fit this into its new home and then put the gauges in place. So next thing we need to install is the rudder reference transducer. This is another piece of the Autopilot that fastens also to the quadrant on the opposite side of where the electric drive is that controls the boat. So this is a reference transducer, and what its job is to fasten there and have another armature that's extended and attached to the quadrant. And as the rudder turns, this turns with it. And this sends electric feedback to the autopilot control and tells the control exactly where the rudder is. So it always knows, is it at 20 degrees to port, 20 degrees to starboard, where is exactly the rudder, so it knows how much control it's actually making the rudder move. And then next we just double check all connections on the CTOC bus from the ITC5 and into the compass and back of course to the main course computer, and this is where all the central processing takes place. And next thing, with everything hooked up, we do one last systems check to make sure the rudder is moving freely and not binding on anything, and to make sure that our new coupling on the quadrant is holding up and moving smoothly. Only thing left now is power it up and do a systems check. So as you can see, the new gauges are all powered up and working properly. The autopilot's on, the I-70's on, instrumentation's working. We can do a quick test putting it on auto and hitting the -10 to make sure the wheel turns to port, which of course now it is. That's good. Put it back on standby, and then we can go over and have a look at the I-70 gauge and cycle through some of the various screens that will be available once we have all the different gauges and instrumentation hooked up. And everything is good, and as you can see now the boat steers easily enough that even Lucky the Parrot can drive it. So on that note, we'll call it a day on this project. Hope you enjoyed this edition, and we'll invite you to keep an eye out for new editions of Just Another Day in Paradise in the near future. So until then, take care. See you out there.